Welcome to the US Daily Brief channel. Since February 24, Ukraine continues to defend against the relentless attacks of Russia. However, there is an issue that everyone wonders how Ukraine resisted and is resisting against the Russian army, the second largest power in the world. How did the Russian army come across such incredible resistance on the territory of Ukraine, where it confidently took steps to invade, and faltered? The Ukrainian armed forces first prevailed over the Russian army in Kiev, and then the Ukrainian armed forces liberated the occupied lands in the north and northeast. Later, it is marching against the Russian army in Kharkiv and now the Donbass region. This was actually a possibility that seemed very unlikely as the Russian army was entering Ukrainian territory. The Ukrainian armed forces seem to be much less in number and much weaker as combat vehicles compared to the Russian army. When we look at February 24, Ukraine had 246,000 active military personnel, and Russia, considering these data, thought that it could easily exceed 125,600 Ukrainian ground soldiers. But there was something the Russians missed. They were regional defense and offensive forces that fought for their homeland in Ukraine and consisted of a total of more than 900,000 armed soldiers together with the Ukrainian army. A total of over 900,000 fighters are thought to be currently fighting against the Russian army, including the army, including paramilitary groups such as the Azov Battalion. These figures include the number of military personnel that Ukraine lost, over 25,000, and the number of wounded, which is about twice that. However, wounded soldiers and experienced soldiers in territorial defense train inexperienced civilians. It is thought that there are over 600,000 civilians armed in Ukraine. Among the 900,000 fighters armed for their freedom against the Russian occupation in Ukraine, over 246,000 Ukrainian armed forces, over 60,000 international legions, and the rest include local police, guerrilla groups in the region, partisan groups and paramilitary groups all. In fact, every house can now be used as a castle. No matter how strong Russia's army is, Putin has encountered unexpected resistance and an unexpected number of soldiers in Ukraine. There were two important points that Russia could not calculate when entering Ukraine. The first was that Russia did not think that Ukraine could create a regular regional defense force by arming hundreds of thousands of people, and the second was the strength of the Ukrainian people's belief in freedom. After the beginning of the war, the regional defense forces were organized by the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, and defense forces were formed in at least 50 regions. There were around 1 million reserve soldiers in Ukraine, and the guerrillas that Ukraine raised within itself began to take an active role in the war. Ukraine did not achieve this all at once. At the beginning of February, Russia may have made a surprise by making the whole world believe that it will not enter Ukraine, but Ukraine never believed it and has been preparing its army against the Russian invasion for 8 years. Here, the regional defense forces are made up of people fighting for Ukraine's security, including Ukrainian civilians and local police. Zelensky has believed in his community since the first day of the war and knows that they stand by him and believe in a free Ukraine. Civilians fighting on the front lines had two options. To deal with the war, they had to either flee or fight. They chose to fight. With few exceptions, the Ukrainian government has banned men between the ages of 18 and 60 from leaving the country, inviting them to stay and fight or otherwise aid the war effort. Many civilians here were people who had never fought before. However, they preferred to remain civilians and fight at the front. Their greatest fear was that most of them had lived through the Soviet era and their children did not want to be subjugated by Putin's Russia, the new version of the Soviet Union. Civilians in the area sold their suits and laptops and exchanged them for AK-47s. There was only one reason for this. Join the Ukrainian armed forces as a volunteer military unit to fight the Russian army. Hundreds of thousands of people have done this. It is known that the people tried to stop them by throwing Molotov cocktails at the Russian tanks during the siege of Kyiv. This is the picture that the resistance gives us in total. A nation that fights all the way and tries to save their country. The report that even Russian-speaking people living in Ukraine, whom Putin defends so much, are fighting against the Russian army, shocked the Kremlin this week. Here was the other point that Putin could not calculate. There were two options for the Ukrainians, either to sit and wait, or to take up arms and fight. the patriotic Ukrainian people began to fight to protect their land. Perhaps these people were not an obstacle to airstrikes and artillery missiles. However, the city sieges, the most critical corner of the war, revealed the abilities of these reserve soldiers and guerrillas. Ukrainian officials announced in early April that they expected a full-scale Ukrainian guerrilla movement to emerge in late spring. They were right. A resistance broke out in Ukraine and the guerrilla movement stood against the Russian army with all its might. As we mentioned earlier, the breaking point of the war was the emergence of the guerrillas. Ukrainians in the Russian-occupied areas mobilized traditional forms of resistance. Many actions were carried out within this guerrilla movement. Tanks belonging to the Russian army were sabotaged. Assassination of high-ranking officers of the Russian army and propaganda on behalf of the Ukrainian armed forces were carried out in the region. It is of course possible that Ukrainian special forces were involved in some of these actions. Data is also likely to be missing, as some actions are probably not reported. Even so, the number of guerrilla actions is impressive and indicative of a growing trend towards partisan activity. Here is some remarkable data. It is also that these partisan activities take place mostly in the Russian-occupied city of Melitopol. This statement can be reached by looking at the data published by the Institute of War Studies in Ukraine. Likewise, in Berdyansk, a large partisan army carried out propaganda via telegram. The partisans chanted slogans and organized the public for forms of resistance. However, this community has not taken action yet. As a result of these activities, the morale of the Russian military, which was the target of nearly 200 fatal stabbings and shootings, deteriorated completely. But the most critical point here will be this. If these partisan activities turn into a guerrilla movement as in the liberated areas of Ukraine, and if they act simultaneously with the Ukrainian armed forces, much more trouble may befall the Russian army. Because the Ukrainian armed forces, which can easily beat the Russian columns with heavy weapons from the west, have some difficulties in their attacks on the inner parts of the cities. Ukrainians expect their counterattack to be successful. They believe their troops are better than their Russian counterparts, and their Western-made weapons will be better than most of the aging Russian equipment. If the guerrillas could hit the Russian lines from behind while the army attacked from the front, the effect could be equivalent to encircling the Russian armed forces. This could mean that Putin's army will disintegrate completely. Even if the guerrilla movement created by the Ukrainian people is not successful, it will be enough to disturb the Russian army and Russia will start to shift troops behind the front to suppress the guerrillas. This will give a great advantage to the Ukrainian armed forces attacking from the front lines. Even if the local people support the Ukrainian resistance movement to the end, it seems that the full realization of this movement is possible at the beginning of August. The operation, which started at the end of May and has continued to grow until today, is getting stronger support every day and causes Putin to break into a cold sweat. Putin has to step back from attacking the civilian population. International law clearly protects civilians who have committed no crimes. Russia, on the other hand, abolished the age limit for the soldiers it recruited in order to increase the number of the army that is decreasing day by day in Ukraine. President Vladimir Putin signed a law allowing people over the age of 40 to join the armed forces. The main aim was to reach the number of soldiers who would be experienced and able to overcome the deficiencies in the region. However, in an intelligence report published recently, it is stated that Russia could not find the soldiers it was looking for. At a point where even the soldiers in Ukraine are tired of fighting and the Ukrainian war is not believed, it does not seem very possible for Putin to find new soldiers for himself. It is claimed that the salary to be given to the new soldiers who will join the army to fight in Ukraine is very high, but even this does not convince the people. In addition, the current soldiers in the Russian army receive 3 times less salary than the newly recruited ones, and they say that they are very unhappy with this situation and do not want to fight.